I'm Margaret Blake. I'm 74. Retired. And I still do the crossword in pen. That morning, I was supposed to be on a flight to Oregon to spend the holidays with my sister at her lake house. My bag was packed. My boarding pass printed. I had even double-checked the oven, the locks, and left the porch light on a timer like I always do when I go away. Everything was in motion, until something made me stop halfway to the airport. I was just pulling into long-term parking when I realized I'd forgotten a document. Not just any document. It was the original copy of Edward's will, the one with his handwritten notes. I told myself it would only take 5 minutes. Ronin. Grab the folder from the drawer in the study and head back out. I even left the engine running for a moment, like I'd be right back. But when I opened the front door, something felt different. The air inside was still, almost staged. I didn't call out like I normally would. My keys were in my hand, but I didn't drop them into the bowl near the door. I just stood there. Then I heard voices coming from the study. Low, steady, intentional. I didn't move at first. I leaned against the hallway wall, the wood cold against my back. And I listened. I knew both voices instantly. One was my son, Lucas. The other was a lawyer I had met once, years ago. During Edward's estate work, I only caught a few phrases. Diminished capacity, filing for guardianship, misplacing things. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. I just stood there while something deep inside me shifted. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't been ready to admit until then. My son wasn't checking in on me. He was checking boxes. That's where this story really begins. Not with a holiday trip or a forgotten document, but with a woman standing in her own hallway, quietly realizing her life was being rearranged without her consent. The hallway was colder than I remembered. Not the kind of cold from the weather, but the kind that comes from silence, sitting too long in a space. I didn't call out when I stepped inside. My heels clicked softly against the floor. But even that sound felt wrong. Like I was interrupting something sacred or secret. I didn't drop my keys in the bowl. I just stood still, listening. From the study, I heard voices. Low, measured, familiar. One belonged to my son. The other, I recognized after a pause, was Ashby. Ashby was the lawyer Lucas had brought around a few years ago, supposedly to help close out Edward's estate. He always spoke in clipped phrases and legal terms, like emotions were inefficient. Even now, I could hear that same tone wrapped around words that made my stomach turn. If she's showing signs, we can make the case. That was the first sentence that struck me. My heart started to beat slower. Not faster. Like it was trying to dull the edges of what I was hearing. She's 74. With the right documentation, diminished capacity isn't difficult to prove. Those were Ashby's words. Dry. Clinical. Lucas responded with examples. She's been repeating herself. Forgot her tax appointment last spring. The list went on. I didn't breathe. Not fully. Just enough to stay quiet. They weren't whispering. But they weren't careless either. They were building something. A case. A version of me that I didn't recognize. I had walked into my own home to grab a folder. Instead, I found my name being shaped into a legal strategy by my only son. My feet stayed planted near the hallway wall, just around the corner from the archway. My hands were cold. But I didn't shake. They talked about paperwork, about options, about timelines. Lucas said he'd started documenting small things. Mail left unopened. Dates I'd mixed up. He called it a pattern. I wanted to scream his name. I wanted to walk in and make them look me in the eye. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped back slowly. I didn't want the floorboards to give me away. My body knew something my mind was still catching up to. That I was not safe in that room. Outside. The sun was still shining. The same warm, golden light that had greeted me just 10 minutes earlier. But I felt none of it. I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the windshield. My hands were still on the steering wheel. My fingers curled against the leather. Not out of anger, but to remind myself I was still here. I had worked night shifts when Lucas was a boy. Cancelled vacations. Made do with one car so he could go to college without debt. And now, here he was, sorting through me like I was one of Edward's old files. Preparing a summary of what I no longer remembered. But the worst part wasn't the list. It was realizing I had known. Somewhere deep down, I had known this shift in him had already happened. There had been clues. The way he started speaking for me at appointments. How he switched my accountant without telling me. How he said things like it's easier if I manage it. I had called it help. I had named it care. I had mistaken control for concern. And now I had heard the truth. Not shouted. Not slammed into my chest. But spoken softly in my own home. That was the moment the roles changed. I was no longer the mother first. I had become something else. Something to be handled. But I also felt something else. Not rage. Not sorrow. Just a quiet, sharp return to myself. I turned the key in the ignition. I didn't go back inside. I didn't confront him. I drove. The flight would leave without me. My sister would wonder. But I had just witnessed the erasure of my autonomy being drafted like a memo. And in that quiet retreat from my own front door, I realized I had a choice. I could let this happen. Or I could prepare. And so I began. Not with shouting. But with listening. I didn't take the turn toward the interstate. I drove past the on-ramp and kept going without thinking. Letting instinct guide me through streets I hadn't seen in years. The sky was clear. But everything inside me felt cloudy. Somewhere between stoplights. My hands turned the wheel on their own. I passed the old movie theater. The corner where the florist used to be. And finally pulled up in front of a bakery, tucked between a laundromat and a faded barber shop. The awning was new. But the smell drifting through the open door was exactly the same. Cinnamon. Butter. Toasted almonds. It hit me in the chest like a memory I wasn't prepared for. This was where Edward and I used to come every Sunday. Rain or shine. Back when we still lived in that 2-bedroom apartment above the pharmacy. I parked and walked inside. The counter had been updated. Shiny and modern. But the tables were still mismatched. And each one held a tiny vase of fresh flowers. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window without looking at the menu. The cup was warm in my hands. And I held it there for a while before taking a sip. Outside. People passed by in coats and scarves. Heads down. Rushing somewhere. But I sat still. Like time had bent around me, just enough to let me breathe. I remembered sitting at that same table with Edward. His newspaper folded just so. While Lucas stacked sugar packets into little towers, he used to ask questions about everything. Bridges. Elevators. Train engines. He didn't want answers. He wanted diagrams. And I gave them to him. I used to bring books home from the library. I'd circle paragraphs in pencil. I signed him up for robotics camp before he even asked. He was curious. Not entitled. At least back then. Somewhere along the way. Something shifted. Not all at once. Just a slow drift I had ignored. I finished half the coffee and left. The taste lingered. Not from the beans. But from the ache in my chest. I zipped up my coat and got back into the car. The next place I stopped was the library. The same one I had worked at for almost 2 decades. It was late afternoon by then. the sky already slipping into winter gray. I parked in the back. Same spot I used to choose when I opened the building early for archives duty. My feet moved out of habit. I didn't hesitate when I walked through the glass doors. Inside, the carpeting had changed. So had the checkout system. But the smell was the same. Paper, dust, and old wood. It made my shoulders drop in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. I passed the fiction stacks and headed toward the back room. The archives hadn't moved, still tucked behind the double doors with the flickering light overhead. There was a young woman at the desk. I nodded once and asked if I could review a file I had cataloged years ago. She didn't ask why. Just handed me a clipboard and pointed to the far table. My hands still knew where to look. The folder was thick. Not because of the will itself, but because Edward had filled it with notes, arrows, sidebars, clipped handwriting that used to frustrate interns and make perfect sense to me. I sat with those pages spread out in front of me. My fingers traced the familiar pen marks. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just let the past wrap around me like something worn but warm. On the last page, tucked behind a chart of assets, I found a sticky note. It was faded, but still legible. It said, "If you ever feel unsure, the answer is always in the numbers." I sat back in the chair. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Steady and soft. I looked at the chart again. Next to each item, Edward had written D to retain. Or D, unless legally challenged. Not Lucas. Not shared control. Just D. That note didn't just name me. It trusted me. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by manila folders and the hum of the archives room, I felt something return. Not pride, not anger, just the sensation of standing back inside my own skin. I reached into my bag, pulled out a small notepad, and began making a list. First, copies. Second, legal counsel. Third, audit of all account changes since Edward passed. I underlined each item with a steady hand. My breath came easy. The cold I had felt all day had started to lift. By the time I stepped back outside, the sun had dipped below the rooftops. The wind had picked up. But I didn't rush. My steps were slow, but no longer uncertain. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind was sorting itself out. I lay in bed, not counting hours, but pieces. By morning, I had a plan. I moved slowly. Not from pain, but to make it look real. I left the sugar canister open and let a spoon rest in the sink. I wiped away only part of a spill on the counter and set the kettle just off-center on the stove. I left the thermostat a few degrees too low. The kind of small disarray that could pass as forgetfulness. I slipped an old voice recorder into the inside pocket of my robe. It was one Edward and I used for interviews back when we were archiving local veterans' stories. The battery still held. At 10:30, I left the front door unlocked and sat at the kitchen table with a crossword puzzle only half filled. The pen had no cap. I circled the same clue twice. Lucas arrived without calling. He never did these days. He walked in with a grocery bag and a soft smile I had learned to read better over time. He kissed the top of my head and commented on how chilly the house felt. I told him I must have forgotten to adjust the heat again. His eyes lingered on the thermostat before he set the bag down. He unpacked slowly. A container of chicken soup, a fresh loaf of bread, and a box of my favorite crackers. He moved through the kitchen like he owned it. And for a long time, I had let him. He asked if I had been sleeping well. I looked at him and said I wasn't sure. Then I trailed off in the middle of a sentence about the neighbor's new mailbox. He smiled like a parent amused by a child. I let the pause sit between us. I wanted him to be comfortable. People show more when they think they're winning. After lunch, he stood by the sink and looked over the mail I had deliberately stacked in disarray. There was an envelope from my insurance provider on top. I told him I hadn't opened it yet. He offered to help sort it out. I pretended not to hear. He moved on. The conversation turned casual, but his tone stayed steady. Then he mentioned assisted living. He said he had been researching some places. Options. He called them. Places with gardens and memory care. I blinked slowly and nodded. I told him it might be nice to have someone else handle the cooking. He looked relieved. I watched the line of his jaw soften. He stayed a little longer, mentioning how hard it was to keep track of my pills on my own. I told him sometimes I forget which ones I've taken. Then I asked him what day it was. His smile deepened. He thought it was working. He believed he was preparing me, gently guiding me toward the decision he had already made. When he left, I waited until the car pulled out of the driveway. Then I went into the study and took the recorder from my robe. I placed it on the desk and rewound the tape. Every word, every shift in tone, every careful phrase was now documented. I wrote the date on a sticky note and labeled the file Visit 1. I stored it in a locked drawer under Edward's old maps. Then I sat with my tea and watched the street go quiet again. 2 days later, I placed a second recorder under the bookshelf in the hallway. Lucas always paced there when he was nervous. I made sure the mic had a clear line to the porch. I left the refrigerator slightly open that morning. I set the teacup on the windowsill instead of the table. I let my hair stay a little messy and wore slippers outside. Lucas showed up again just after 10. He said he was just checking in. He handed me a new brochure from a care facility. I held it in both hands and let my fingers tremble slightly. I told him the pictures were pretty. He leaned in and began describing the walking trails and the music room. He said he had spoken to Ashby. He said they could handle the paperwork quickly if I was ready. I asked if we'd already talked about that last time. He smiled like he was proud of me for remembering. When he stepped outside to take a phone call, I listened through the open window. His voice was steady but clear. He said I was close to agreeing and mentioned expedited review. I didn't move. I let the porch swing creak under my weight. I held the folder in my lap like a passenger holding a ticket to somewhere they didn't want to go. After he left, I retrieved the recorder. I labeled the file Visit 2. I saved a copy to a flash drive and placed it in the small lockbox I kept under the sink. I didn't feel heroic. I didn't feel brave. But I felt awake. The silence had become my tool. Not a cage. Not a sign of weakness. A place to listen without being seen. And in that space, I was building something solid. One visit at a time. One detail at a time. I found Milen's number tucked in the back of my old address book, written in blue ink beside a scribbled reminder to return her favorite reference manual. We hadn't spoken in years. Not out of distance. Just the way life folds in after retirement and loss. I left a short message on her voicemail, calm and direct, and said I needed someone I could trust. She replied within the hour. No questions. Just a time. When she arrived, she wore a navy wool coat and carried a leather case like the ones we used back in the archives. Her expression was steady. Not warm. Not cold. Just grounded. We sat at the kitchen table, and I poured chamomile tea into mismatched mugs. I slid the file folder across to her without a word. She opened it, listened to the first recording, and didn't interrupt once. When it ended, she looked up and said we would fix it. There was no dramatics in her tone. Just quiet certainty. She opened her laptop and began typing. She asked about my current power of attorney, whether it had been updated since Edward passed. I told her no. She nodded once. Like that was all she needed. The first thing we did was revoke Lucas's authority. She drafted a new legal document and walked me through each sentence. She explained every part clearly. like she always had when we trained interns. Then, we created a digital backup plan. She brought a small scanner and set it up in the den. We labeled everything together. To using the same naming system we once used for war archives. I watched her work. Precise and fast. But never rushed. She wasn't shocked by what I had shared. She had seen these patterns before. She told me this wasn't about punishment. It was about clarity. About drawing a legal circle around myself before someone else boxed me in. We scanned Edward's annotated will, added the recordings, and uploaded everything into encrypted cloud storage. She created a folder labeled Margaret Legal Private and gave me a secure password I could actually remember. Then she walked me through how to update and maintain it. Before she left, she printed one clean sheet of paper. It was a formal revocation of the previous power of attorney. My name, his name, and the date? I signed it without hesitation. She slid it into her briefcase. Calm as always. Then she looked at me and said this was only the first step. After she left, I didn't feel anxious. I felt steady. For the first time in weeks. I wasn't documenting alone. The house felt quiet again. But not like before. This silence had weight to it. Not absence. It felt like something was being built. One paper. One decision at a time. This wasn't revenge. It was reinforcement. And I was no longer just protecting memories. I was protecting myself. The next morning, I opened the old filing cabinet in my closet and pulled out every folder with my name on it. Medical records, bank statements, tax returns, even utility bills I'd been saving out of habit. I stacked them on the dining table, letting the paper speak before I did. I started with my doctor. Dr. Elkins had been seeing me for over a decade. When I asked for a cognitive evaluation, he didn't question me. He ran the tests, checked my chart, and signed a letter confirming my mental clarity. I folded it carefully and slid it into a new folder, marked medical. That folder became the cornerstone. Then I moved to my finances. I printed out statements with notes I had made in the margins. Handwritten calculations. Budget adjustments. Grocery lists clipped with receipts. Some people see paper as clutter. I see it as memory. These documents held a map of my days. Each item I dated, labeled, and scanned. Malen had shown me how to organize the drive. And now I moved through it like I had never left the library. I gave every folder a clear title and backed it up twice. There was something steadying about the process. Like restoring a lost collection after a flood. I wasn't frantic. I was focused. I dug through old drawers and found a folder labeled Household. Inside were notes to the plumber. Paint swatches from a project Lucas never finished. And a printed repair schedule from 2 years ago. I added them to the archive. In the back of my nightstand, I found a notebook from my last year at the university. Pages filled with meeting notes, project outlines, and dates scribbled in the corner. My handwriting had not changed. Each file became a quiet refusal. A way to say, I remember without ever raising my voice. I was not building a defense. I was building a record. I labeled one folder personal and placed inside it the note Edward had once written. The one that said I had always seen more clearly than I believed. I added a scanned photo of us from the archives room. Covered in dust and smiling. That image reminded me I had not always been invisible. By the end of the week, I had 3 printed indexes and a digital backup with password protection. I stored a copy in my desk. One in the lockbox. And one on a drive hidden beneath the floorboards. I wasn't proving anything to Lucas. I was reminding myself that I had always been the archivist of this life. And no one else had the right to rewrite it. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel before I saw his face. Lucas didn't call ahead. He never did when he wanted the upper hand. I stood by the window as he walked up the path with a folder tucked under his arm. His shoulders were tight. His steps measured. I opened the door before he could knock. I didn't smile. But I didn't shut him out. I stepped aside and let him in. The air in the house was warm from the cider I had simmering on the stove. He commented on the smell. I nodded and said it was something Edward used to make this time of year. He didn't sit. He placed his folder on the kitchen table and stayed standing. He said Ashby had stepped away. Unexpectedly. And it left a few things unclear. I listened, letting the words hang without response. Then, he mentioned concerns about paperwork changing without his knowledge. I poured cider into 2 cups, handed him one, and sat across from him. My movements were quiet, intentional. I waited until he took a sip. Then I reached into the drawer beside me and pulled out a small stack of documents. They were clean copies, arranged in the order Mellon had suggested. I placed them in front of him one by one. Revocation of power of attorney. Cognitive assessment signed by Dr. Rissos. Elkins. Updated. Will. Notarized affidavit, affirming full legal and medical capacity. He didn't reach for them. He stared at the top page, then glanced up at me. His jaw shifted once, like he was chewing something bitter. I let the silence sit. Then I said I had made responsible decisions for myself, that I understood exactly what I was doing, and pretending otherwise would no longer serve him. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice, but his eyes moved toward the hallway, scanning like he expected someone else to be there. I kept my voice steady and added one more thing. Not all silence is weakness. Sometimes it's the sound of preparation. He stood still for another moment, then gathered the documents without folding them. He placed them back on the table, untouched. He said nothing else as he walked to the door. He didn't slam it. He didn't look back. Just stepped outside and left the same way he came. I waited until I heard the engine fade. Then I picked up the recorder hidden beneath the napkin holder and stopped it. The file was already labeled in my mind. Quiet confrontation. Full clarity. And as I stood in my kitchen, hands calm, breath even, I didn't feel the weight of a fight. I felt the stillness of having nothing left to prove. Tessa arrived on a bright Saturday afternoon with a canvas duffel, a laptop bag, and a quiet kind of energy. She moved through the hallway like it already belonged to her. Not in the way someone takes over a space, but like someone settling into rhythm. She didn't ask too many questions. She didn't need to. She set her things in the guest room and started plugging in chargers and lining up her notebooks without making a sound. By evening, the kitchen smelled like lemon verbena. She had found my tea tin without asking and brewed a pot while humming something soft. Her voice stayed low, but her presence filled the house. We didn't talk much that first night. I sat at the table and watched her move like a quiet current. She organized her files, labeled folders with clean handwriting, and added a backup drive to the cloud system Mellon had set up. She asked if I minded if she digitized some of my older journals. I told her that would be nice. She treated each page with care, scanning gently and placing each notebook back exactly where it came from. The house didn't echo anymore. I heard footsteps in the morning, drawers opening, the kettle starting before I got out of bed. There was life in the corners again. We took out the trash together, rearranged the file cabinet, and folded laundry while a playlist played softly from her phone. Nothing dramatic. Just small pieces of a normal day stitched back into place. One afternoon, I found her labeling boxes in the garage. She asked if we could archive them together. I said yes. And we spent an hour building a list with dates and short descriptions. There was no rush. No deadline. Just keep movement forward. She made dinner twice that week. Nothing complicated. Just roasted vegetables, baked chicken, And the kind of warmth that doesn't come from spice but from intention. At night, I heard her typing from down the hall. Not frantic. Just steady. Like someone building something worth keeping. She didn't ask about Lucas. She didn't press about the past. She made space for the present. By the end of the week, she had added labels to the pantry shelves and printed dividers for the document binders. I hadn't realized how much the space needed structure again. Not to be controlled, but to be lived in. The house had changed. So had I? The silence no longer pressed against me. It breathed alongside me. And for the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't just defending what I had left. I was growing something new. There was a time when I second-guessed myself at every turn. I'd forget where I set my keys and wonder if maybe Lucas was right. I confused tiredness for decline. Silence for weakness. But it wasn't weakness. It was grief that hadn't settled. A life that had shifted too quickly. And the weight of being alone after so many years of being part of something. I was never fading. I was just overwhelmed. Now, I see the difference. Doubt is loud, but clarity is quiet, steady, and impossible to argue with once it arrives. I used to think defending myself meant proving everything, explaining every decision, every mistake, every gap in memory like I was being graded. But the truth is, owning my story didn't require permission. It required presence. There was no moment when I became stronger. It happened gradually. Through every list I made. Every file I labeled. Every quiet, no, I said, without raising my voice. I don't feel angry when I think about Lucas. I feel still. Because I know what he tried to take from me. And I know he failed. He wanted to frame me as someone slipping. Someone easy to fold into a care plan and tuck away. But I remained upright. And I stayed myself. I've learned that dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't slam doors or make speeches. It looks like showing up at your own table with a folder in hand and saying, I know what I'm doing. And it doesn't always look brave. Sometimes it looks like labeling documents. Or heating tea. Or listening instead of speaking. This wasn't about revenge. That word never sat well with me. What I wanted was air. And space. And truth written in my own words. Now, when I wake up, I don't check the locks. I open the blinds. I walk through this house knowing I reclaimed it. Not just legally, but emotionally. My name is still on every page that matters. Not because I fought louder, but because I stood still long enough for the noise to pass. And in that quiet, I found myself again. Fully. Gently. Without apology. If you've ever felt dismissed or overlooked, if someone has ever made you feel like your voice didn't count, I hope this story reminded you that silence is not the same as weakness. Sometimes it's the space where strength waits. Sometimes it's where clarity begins. You don't have to raise your voice to reclaim what's yours. You don't have to explain your worth to people who've already decided not to see it. You just have to know who you are. Even when no one else does. Your story matters. Even if it's never been told out loud. It matters if it's scribbled in a notebook. Kept in a drawer. Or living quietly in your chest. It matters because it's yours. If this touched something in you, feel free to share your thoughts. Or leave a piece of your own story in the comments. Or simply carry this one with you for a little while. That's more than enough. That's how we remind each other we're not invisible. And we never were.